Well, welcome everybody to our weekly 9 to 5 stream.
Weekly?
Regular. Yes, so today we have here Rob Carr, the senior sound designer at Red Hill Games, and then myself, Semyon, also known as Spark13 on Discord. I'm the community specialist here at Red Hill Games. And yeah, so today we have prepared a very interesting stream. We're gonna talk a bit more about game development of 9 to 5, but also we're gonna talk about some news, and we're gonna start with that. So, one of the latest news from Red Hill Games is that we have finally launched our new and shiny 9 to 5 Steam page, and you can see it here, and like we have updated with all the latest information, some new screenshots there, and we encourage you to follow it and to add 9 to 5 to your wish list, so you never miss a new announcement, or if you want to participate in the closed test, that page is going to be the new home of all the 9 to 5 tests. Yes, and another piece of news is we're going to talk a little bit about the closed test. So the closed test number 3 will happen, but unfortunately at this point we cannot announce the date yet, but it's going to be the biggest test in terms of the scope. We have made huge changes to the game UI and the metagame, so the armory and the crafting going to be easier to grasp for new players, and also going to feature more in-game tutorials, and onboarding of the game will become quite easy at this point. And also, in the test, we're probably going to test the progression and the missions, so stay tuned for that. But topic of today's test is actually development of 9 to 5. And this is a series of new streams that we're going to be having more or less regularly from now on. And we're going to talk with developers of 9 to 5 and discuss different aspects of the development. And each stream will have a particular topic, be it level design, audio design, metagame, gameplay, guns of 9 to 5, and everything in between. And so today, with the first episode, we're going to talk about audio design. And here is our resident sound designer, Rob, who single-handedly handled all the sounds you can hear in 9 to 5 up to this point. So Rob.
Hello.
What can you tell us about audio design? What is that animal?
That animal is the bane of my life. Is what that animal is. My job here at Red Hill Games is to oversee all the audio design, not just from a sourcing of assets aspect, but also through implementation and authoring, all the way through from recording assets that we might need, and then designing them in a way that actually works in a context within the game, and then we implement it with a way that makes sense and in a way that sort of complements gameplay as well as doesn't interfere with the second-to-second aspect of things. The nature of the beast is that it's a big job, and there's like when I was first approached about the stream, Simeon was like, "So, well, what is it you actually do?" And I sent him a bit of a beast email. He was like, "Yeah, we don't have that long." So we've kind of had to sort of not necessarily dumb things down, but I think today we're going to concentrate mostly on things that myself and I think the rest of the team think are important for players of the game and people that like specifically first-person shooters. So in today's stream, we're going to focus on specific aspects of the game and how the audio was designed for that, the implications and the scale and the scope of that. But we're also going to touch upon some of the other elements and areas as well. So because one of the big things that I'm asked regularly, I've done several lectures for various other communities and conferences and places of education, and one of the common questions that I'm asked is, sort of like, what's the scale? What's audio design? Why do you do it, and how do you do it, and things like that. And one area that the community are particularly interested in is just how much of it there is and what goes into it. And people have lots of really good ideas and really strong sort of passion about the audio, but they don't really sort of understand the pipeline and how anything works and how we get from a complete silence to this is a gun. So one of the things that we're going to talk through today is going to be the whole process, you know, the entire pipeline of how we go from a silence to a sound, and then how that actually influences other people in the game. So.
Yeah, sound definitely plays an important role, and I don't think there's any aspect of the game that doesn't have sound to it. And it can affect the perception of the player quite dramatically. And yeah, to start our program, we're going to show you a short gameplay clip. It's footage from the development build that we've only recently recorded. It's quite staged, so don't take it for granted. So we want to just show different aspects of sound design, that you can hear the ambient sound and the sound of the guns. And yeah, we're going to talk about it right after the clip.
I'm reloading. Reloading. I'm reloading.
Yes, so this was the gameplay. It doesn't necessarily reflect the actual 9 to 5, so don't take this at face value.
It's very staged in a very specific way for the audience tonight. So like it's not reflective of the time to kill. It's not reflective of like a general mission or gameplay or anything like that. But it does highlight quite nicely some of the points that we want to pick up on tonight. So
yes, exactly. And we're going to start with the guns. So that's this 9 to 5 is an FPS game, and obviously guns and shooting play a major role in the game and its perception.
Reasonably sort of high.
Yeah. Yeah. So, however, in 9 to 5, it's not only about the looks of the gun, but actually how it sounds. And the quality of sound is vital to the gun, as we know. And in 9 to 5, we don't use a real live guns. However, some of the guns are influenced and inspired by real weapons, but they're created to fit the setting of the near future that game is set in. And every type of the gun has a certain sound to it, be it assault rifle, an SMG, or a sniper rifle. And it's very particular. And I guess what is your main goal, Rob, when you are creating a sound of a particular gun? Like,
the first thing when we're dealing with guns is perception is different to reality. A big thing that I get quite a lot of is when people say that doesn't sound anything like an AK-47, which is ironic because some of the assets that we might use might be actually taken from an AK-47. So what people actually mean is their idea and what they think an AK-47 should sound like isn't actually what an AK-47 sounds like. So there's the perception versus the actual reality. In 9 to 5 specifically, what we do is we're deliberately not trying to be anything we're not. You know, we're not a simulation. You know, we're not a military shooter. Like, we're not even trying to be that. So we get a little bit of sort of freedom when it comes down to the guns, and we get a little bit of sort of wiggle room there when it comes down to the creative process and the creation of guns. Having said that, we do have an audience that have expectations. If they have an assault rifle that kind of looks and feels like an AK-47, then they probably want it to sound like an AK-47. Well, now, with 9 to 5 and the weapons that we already have sort of announced and that we've already sort of talked about in previous streams and in various trailers and stuff, we have obviously a selection of very different type of weapon. So, without going into too many specifics here, we have a type of weapon. So we have an assault rifle versus an SMG or an LMG, or we might have a shotgun or a pistol or a sniper rifle. and those are very wide-ranging. Like, you know, there's hundreds of ARs in the world, and you know, in the game there might be just a handful of ARs, but we need to make sure that if you are a player, we want you to know the difference between if an opponent has an SMG or an AR. And the main reason why we would want to differentiate between those two sounds is depending on what armor the player might be wearing, or it might heavily sort of, you know, it might change their gameplay tactics as to how they play the game, as to what they can hear. If they hear someone with a really big, high rifle, you know, high caliber LMG, you know, blistering away through things, they might think twice about going out from cover. But if they hear someone with a fairly small pop, pop, pop kind of 9mm pistol, then they might feel confident with their heavy armor about actually, you know, breaching a doorway or doing something.
Well, how is it that you help players understand from the distance, with the help of the sound, what kind of weapon might their opponent carry? Like, what are the instruments of the sound designer in this perspective?
In this particular respect, it's about the location of where the player is, and a lot of it is not necessarily circumstance-driven, but location-driven circumstance. So depending on whether they are in an interior or an exterior, or depending on how far away they are, you know, every weapon in the game has its own unique distance attenuation. And in later streams, it's going to be explained how and why we made those decisions creatively. But from my perspective at the moment, it was very much a creative thing, where high calibered and high powered rifles, for an example, you know, the big, you know, the beast sniper rifle, you know, people should know that you've got that anywhere on the map. So if you hear that at a distance, then that's one of those things where you're like, oh, that's whatever that was big, and it's going to cause me a lot of damage. Maybe I should stay away from the windows. But at the same time, if you can't, you know, if a gun is quieter or doesn't sound as powerful, then that can again influence your decisions, and the distance of which you can hear that can affect those decisions that you make as well. A really good example of this might be being caused damage versus what you can hear. We made a creative decision that if you can't hear a weapon, it can't deal you damage. This is obviously a work in progress and is liable to change, but at the moment, you know, the way things are standing at the moment, the creative decisions that we made on a test purpose is if you can't hear the gun, then you're fairly safe, you know, and that way you're not in a position where you can hear something, but it's not really dealing you damage. But at the same time, it also alleviates the problem of you having damage dealt to you, but you can't hear the weapon, which again alleviates some stresses that you might have. You know, nobody likes playing games where they're one-shotted and they killed him. Like, well, where did that come from? You know, who killed me? I don't know. I didn't hear the gunshot. So we've kind of made some creative decisions in that respect.
All right, and maybe now we can look into how the actual sounds of the guns are made. And this is an educational stream, so we have prepared a video for you where Rob would explain.
I should a brief note about what you're about to see. Before we do anything in the game, we actually have to work out what those guns are, what type of gun they are, the kind of caliber of which they are, and the kind of feel that we want them to have. Now, when we do all of this, we have to source the assets. Now, there are multiple different ways of which we can source assets for any number of different reasons. In this particular example, for the benefit of pipeline ease and pacing, and just to make sure that we get everything done to the level that it needs to be in the time frame that we have, we're using a plugin by Krotos Audio called Weaponizer. Now, Weaponizer, as a bit of a background here, is a plugin that I use for my DAW, which me personally I use Pro Tools. It is a sound designer's tool. This has pre-recorded stock sourced recordings of a variety of different weapons. What makes it unique for our particular needs is we can mix and match different things. So if we want one sound, like this is an AR which is an AK-47, we can use assets of an AK-47, but we might decide actually we want it to sound a little bit heavier than that, or we want it to sound a little bit different, and we can add in or take away characteristics. And in the following video that you're going to see, this is going to talk you through the pipeline of how I go from a silence to actually having a gun sound that we can actually implement and add into the game.
Yes, please roll the clip.
Hello. In this video I'm going to show you what we use at Red Hill Games to produce the weapon sounds for 9 to 5. In this particular example we're using a plugin that I'm using with Pro Tools. This plugin is by Krotos Audio and is called Weaponizer. Weaponizer works on 4 basic principles. It splits each weapon into 4 aspects of sound. We have onset, body, thump and the tail. Now as you can see from the listing here, the library is quite extensive and we can pick between a selection of different guns or different ideas, whether it be sweeteners or the burst guns or tails. You know, we can be very specific when it comes down to the search facilities here. In this particular example I'm going to show you one of the weapons that we played with in alpha called the Alliance SMG Basic, and I'm going to show you how we constructed the sounds and how we record and source these sounds ready for use in the game. Now for the most part when it comes down to weapons in 9 to 5, we're trying to make them close enough to the real world weapon but also give them a little bit of a unique flavor and a little bit more characteristics when it comes down to our actual in-game sort of facilities. In this particular basis we're basing the Alliance SMG Basic on the Mac 10, which is an SMG. Now the 4 sections that we have are based around these 4 aspects. Now each one is very unique and custom for each weapon. Now to break this down a little bit more, I'm going to basically tell you how this all works. Now the onset is the click of the gun. That's when your finger pulls on the trigger, it makes a click sound, and that's the actual mechanics of the gun. That's a microphone that is literally on the gun itself, and that gives us the sounds that you might hear of just the click or the rattle or the actual mechanism of the gun ejecting the cases. The body would be the bang, if you will. That's the actual the combustion of the bullet as it's ejecting from the shell. The thump would be in this particular case it is a synthesized low frequency thud. This is a bass or a sub frequency that we often use when it comes down to the building of depth within sound. You know, like light guns shouldn't sound very big and boomy. Big heavy guns should sound big and boomy, and thus we would use different thump frequencies. And the tail, as you would imagine, is the echo, if you will. Now in this particular example with the Mac 10 we have the echo at 5 meters, and then we have an echo at 50 meters, which is a microphone 50 meters away from the gun, and here we have one at 100 meters. Okay, and what we use, the reason why we have these in here is so that we can add a little bit of distance attenuation later on when we're actually recording the game. Now in here we have what's called the burst mode. Now at the moment when I just press fire, I've already pre-constructed something here with lots of different assets in, and when I press fire, we hear the single shots, and as you can see it cycles through the different sounds. So if I go into the onset, you can see it cycling through the assets. If I add in the burst mode, this goes from a single shot fire to an automated thing. It will repeatedly fire, and I can change the fire rate on this based on milliseconds. Now if I slow this right down to 100 milliseconds for an example, that's a re-triggering every so often. If I bring that down to about 66, it's much faster. Now it's starting to sound a lot more like an SMG. We bring that down a little bit more. we can make it sound even more. I mean, we can bring it down to a crazy number now. Now what this is doing is this is just cycling through all of the assets, even on an automation basis. Now, realistically in the game, we don't want to play a looped or a multiple triggered sound like this. This is only for my reference, so that I can design the sounds and I can adjust the parameters of the fire rate. Now, when we're in game, actually all we actually need asset wise is this. Because what we're going to do is, as you can see here in the mixer, we actually have a different channel for each element of the sounds, whether it be onset, body, thump and the tail. They are all recorded separately and they're all sourced and exported separately from Pro Tools. In the next video, I'm going to show you what we do with those assets and how we introduce them into the game using Wwise.
Alright, I hope you all enjoyed this nice educational video from Rob. And now we actually, without any break, we're going to show you another clip, and there is an actual examples from the game. You're going to see an assault rifle, an SMG and a sniper rifle. So here you go.
I'm reloading. I'm reloading.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, so now as you can see, we are tinkering with some with actual sounds from the real life, but they have a Rob stamp to them. So, and now Rob, how do sounds get from the sourcing into the game?
Okay, so in the video I talk about there are 4 elements of every gun. There is the onset, which is the actual click of the actual, that's the mechanics of the weapon. We have the body, that's the bang, if you will. That's the combustion of the actual, the pellet inside. We have the thump, that's the bass, the sub, the oomph, if you will. And we have the tail, which is effectively, that's the sound of the environment of which you are in. So those 4 elements that we have, we source through Weaponizer, and we can mix and match, and we can give it specifics, and we can give it each weapon can have its own characteristics, and you know, like bigger guns can have like a bassier thump to them, and like smaller guns can have a little bit more sort of bang to them, rather, you know, a bit more sort of popping sort of sounds in the body. Complicated weapons like an LMG, we can have a lot more clicking and, you know, a lot more of the mechanics in the onset kind of side of things. And we can engineer the guns in a particular way. And once we've actually got those sounds as separate sounds, we actually, each individual section, the onset, body, tail and thump, they're actually 4 individual separate sounds that I record, and we then import them into our middleware software, which is what we use for authoring the sounds. Anybody that's seen me, particularly on some of my previous talks, you'll be familiar with the system that we use is called Wwise. And what I do is I import those files, and each individual sound we can then use as an individual aspect, and we can manipulate those accordingly. So the onset, for an example, we can apply a different distance to that, because I will only really hear the mechanics of the weapon if I'm right next to it. If I'm like 2 or 3 meters away, I probably won't hear that much of the clicking of the trigger and the actual rattle of the gun. I probably won't hear that if I'm 3 meters away. I'll probably only hear the body, which is the bang, and the tail, which is the environment sounds. So like the onset and the thump, again, we can change the distance that we hear those, and we can change how you know, other people hear those sounds as well. And then we can have other elements of that where if we take away the tail, for an example, What we're left with is we're left with the onset, which is the mechanics, the body, which is the bang, and the thump, which is the guts of it, if you will. But there's no echo, there's no environmental sounds. And that ties in quite nicely with when we're going through the actual game world itself, which we'll look into later in regards to the ambience and the rooms, and when it comes down to the interior versus exterior. And we can actually work on like making them sound not just different as a mechanical weapon, but we can also make the environment of which you use those weapons sound unique and different as well. So
yeah, actually, I want to like stay here for a moment and ask some of the questions that our viewers have previously asked on Discord and on social media. So, what qualities should the realistic sound of a weapon have? So, what criteria do you judge and determine whether the sound is qualitatively and realistic or not?
It depends on the visuals. There are some games out there that are simulations, like Escape from Tarkov, for an example, is that's trying to be as realistic as you can be. In that respect, you don't get a lot of wiggle room when it comes down to creative freedom, because there is an expectation from the person that is using that, especially if the kind of person that plays that game is the kind of person that uses those weapons in real life. They have an expectation. If you're playing games which are maybe science fiction or arcadey, if you will, or not based on the real world, but kind of loosely based on that, you can be a little bit, there's a lot more creative wiggle room that you have there, and it gives you an opportunity to set an expectation of your own accord. So in the respect of 9 to 5, what we do is I think about the type of weapon, whether it's an assault rifle or an SMG, and then I think, okay, well, how many of those do we have, and what differentiates the ones that we do have? What's different about them? Like in 9 to 5, we have different weapon manufacturers, and each manufacturer might make a different type of weapon. So we might have one assault rifle which is made by one manufacturer, and we might have another one which is made by a completely different manufacturer. It might be made of different materials, which means the onset might sound different. One might be made of metal, one might be made of plastic. So the clicking and the rattling sound will sound unique and different. Now, for those people that are 4 or 5 meters away, they're not really going to notice that difference. But to the player, it's going to make a difference. When they hear the rattling of the plastic and the clicking when they reload the weapon, it sounds unique and different to the player that's playing it, and that's what gives it the uniqueness. That's the nuances and the subtlety that is brought to the table when the player is like, okay, what gun do I want? Well, this one uses a higher caliber of weapon, so one might be a 5.56 and one might be a 7.62. One is a higher caliber, which the higher caliber guns should sound louder, they should be bigger. The bang, the body of the gun, should sound different to that of a smaller caliber weapon. And the shell casing that is ejected from that will be that of a 7.65 rather than a 5.56. So the sound when you fire your gun and the sound of the pellet being thrown out, that will sound different. The reality is someone stood 10 meters away, they won't know that, they won't care. All they know is you've got an assault rifle, that's all they care about, because they've got their own gun, they're running, they're gunning, they don't really, maybe that's an AK, maybe it's not, maybe it's this, like they don't care. Even in military simulations, they don't care. What they care is am I being shot at? Am I going to die? Will the game, what do I do next? And that's the most important thing. The environments of which we put those weapons in still have to sound unique and different as well. So when we remove the element of the player being outside and we put them on an interior selection, what happens then? Can we still identify the nuances and the characteristics that we've applied to those weapons? And that's where my job gets a little bit more interesting, because we can then say, well, we know that this sounds in this particular way because it's made of plastic instead of metal. We know that this gun uses, it's this caliber instead of this caliber, so it's going to sound this way. The echo of the room and the environment of which we play in, that now changes, but the characteristics are fundamentally still there.
Yeah, actually, and so can you say that like the main aspect that differentiate a super powerful gun and like a small, not very impactful gun is just how loud it is?
No, because well, yes, to a certain extent. In video games, it's not about something being louder. It's more about it's about the feel that it gives you. For an example, the 308 sniper rifle that we have is the biggest, most powerful gun in the whole game. Everybody should hear that, regardless of where they are on the map. And one of the things that I did to give the impression that that gun is a big, almighty, powerful gun is, as part of the tail, we already have the echo of the buildings, and we have the distant echo sounds there. But how do we make that sound a bit thunderous? Well, we add a bit of thunder in there. So actually, as part of the sound design for that weapon, we've actually added in a proper rattle of thunder as part of the sound for that, because when you hear it, you want it to sound like, you know, the gods are not in your favor kind of thing. So we kind of given that impression. That doesn't mean it's going to be louder than everything else. That just means that you can hear it from any point on the map. That means that people, if they can hear it, how close you are to that obviously will adjust the volume of which you hear that. You know, the further away you are, the body and the bulk and the bare bones of the gun, you're not going to hear as much as if you are like stood right next to it. It should be deafening, it should be splitting, it should have everything that you want. And as the person that is firing that gun, every single time you fire that gun should feel really satisfying. It should be exactly the same. So when it comes down to volume and it comes down to perception of volume, frequency and the wide range of what you can actually hear is much more important than how loud something is in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can use that mix and we can use the effect of how loud something is to distinguish something else, which we'll talk about later, which is threat levels and the telegraphing of information to players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and while we're still on the topic of the guns, so obviously 9 to 5 is an online game.
Yes.
And what are there any limitations of being an online game that are put on the sound of guns? Like, for example, a question from a chat actually. So, how does higher rate of fire weapons are? Is there any effect on the network, on the tick rate, with the depending on how frequently the sounds are played, and like, do you need to loop it in some weird manner, or like, what are the technical difficulties you have to overcome?
I can't really speak about tick rate, and I certainly won't talk about what's played on client versus server. However, we do not excuse me, I can speak the English, I promise. We don't use loops. Every single time that the weapon is fired is a single shot sound, and that is by design. We deliberately do that so that every single time that you hear a gunshot, you know that there is some form of damage that might be dealt from that shot that you hear, depending on your range to the player and whether there's an obstacle in the way or something like that. So we don't use loops at all for it. So if you hear a machine gun and you hear something, you know, someone's got a very high fire of rate, like an SMG might have a very high rate of fire, every single shot that you hear is a unique individual sound that is played with a projectile, with a bullet, if you will. You know, it's like, I couldn't possibly talk about whether there are actually bullets that are physically manifested in the game or not, but it's a safe assumption that every shot that you hear is a unique individual bullet that has actually been fired from the player. So, and that is triggered every time the player fires the gun. That is triggered, and that is, you know, that's played for everybody regardless of where they are. There are some elements of the sound design that are client only, but that is not anything to do with what the player does, how they move, or what they do in relation to their guns. So when one player fires the gun, everybody hears it, regardless of where they are on the map. That is a sound that is played. Whether you hear it or not depends on how close you are to that player. Other things are like with the reloading and things. If a player reloads, everybody that is in the vicinity of that player will hear them reload, regardless of what team they're on and regardless of what they're doing at the time.
Okay, well, as there not seem to be any other questions about the guns, let's talk about some other sounds that player hear and which influence the perspective of the game. So, environment. So everything that we can hear outside of the player, like sounds are not necessarily produced by the player. So as we know that almost everything in the game has a physical material assigned to it, and they're affected differently, and it really depends on the context when people hear the sound. So it rather be footstep, bullet impacts, explosions, and let's talk about that. So can you say maybe about ambience? So
sure. Ambience is for 9 to 5. The ambient system it's fairly robust and not necessarily convoluted, but it's a lot more detailed than I think a lot of people actually realise. Mostly because it's not the main focus of the game. The main focus of any game, especially if it's a first-person shooter, is going to be the player. It's how the player sounds when they move, it's their footsteps, it's the gun that they use, and how they interact and engage within the game world. When it comes down to ambience, it's very often overlooked, but at the same time, it's probably one of the single most important things that can ground you in the universe of which you are playing the game. So we've added in there's a lot of elements with the game. We have a city hum, for an example, in the footage that you've seen so far, is a map called Old New York, and in this particular map, as you can see, it's a city. So when we're dealing with that kind of thing, we have a very specific set of sort of sounds that people are expecting to hear within the city environment. Now, as part of the game lore, which I'm sure will be touched upon later, the whole map that you are on is derelict of people. The only people that are on that map are the people that are playing the game. The 3 versus 3 versus 3. So there are only 9 players on that map. They're the only people that are on that map. So that does kind of limit us in a lot of respects when it comes down to the ambience. There are no vehicles that are driving around. We can't have car horns. There's no different peds that are walking around. So we can't have ped chat. We can't have random people picking up phones, or there's not people hiding in their apartment blocks, because everywhere is gone. The whole city is completely deserted. However, that doesn't mean we can't be creative, and it doesn't mean that we can't do really nice, cool things that add in something a little bit cool. For an example, wind is an excellent example. We actually have player elevated differences within the wind. The higher up on the map that the player is, whether you're on the top of a rooftop or if you're in the lowest parts of the sewer, it changes how you hear the wind. The higher up you are, the more windier it might become, the different the wind might become to if you are on ground zero between buildings. If you're in the sewers, for an example, you still might have strong winds, but you shouldn't hear them like you normally hear. You might hear that really low rumbled whistle and hum and things like that. So, and that's based on the player's elevation. So if I'm down on the ground zero and you're at the top of a high building on a rooftop, it will sound different to you than it does to me. That's not a global thing. That's unique to you, the player. Other things that we want to do is we want to introduce things like distant one-shot sounds, like bird song. So you might notice that there might be some very distant bird songs that's happening. Now, at the moment, they're just to give the world a little bit of flavour. In the future, we may be looking into different aspects of that and how we can use bird song and elements of the ambience to actually enhance gameplay. At the moment, that is like a super low priority on my list of things to do, because we've got a whole game to build, and unfortunately we have to, there's things that I want to do and things that I can do, and unfortunately there's another list of things which are things I have to do, and unfortunately the have to kind of outweighs everything. But there are certain elements that have recently been introduced with we're starting to get more VFX into the game. Milan, our VFX artist, has done an incredibly good job with adding sort of subtle little details like pipes that are leaking water, sort of thing. Like there's now an ocean line that sprays water spray over the top of a flood wall kind of thing, and maybe there's some hissing from pipes, sort of thing. So little nuances like that are things that we can add into the game world that actually give it life. It makes it feel more alive rather than just a dead world that nobody really cares about or that there's nothing in. So there is still a long way to go, but there is a lot of things that we can do, and there's a lot of ways that we can influence the sound of that.
Yeah, I guess ambience is something that people don't really pay attention when they're in the heat of the fight, but which really makes the world be alive. And you always notice it when you take a step back and start to listen to what's happening around you. And if there's a dead silence, then it's totally breaks the effect for you.
My dream for this is to have like silly little things that we don't need, but it's easy for me to do that makes a big difference. So like when at some point we're going to introduce the sound of trees that might be moving with the wind. The higher the wind goes, the more intense the wind is, and when we have random gusts of wind that randomly play at particular intervals in the game world, we have these distant one-shot sounds which will randomly play anywhere in the game world, and we have like gusts of wind. We've now hooked that in to the tree sound so that when that sound plays, the volume of the wind gust actually affects how much the trees move, and that's interactive. And that's outside the game. That's all logic that's done inside the authoring software called, in an audio production technique called side chaining. And it's a free thing. It's like we get it for free. But it adds something. When you hear a gust of wind and you're stood next to a tree, the tree should move when you hear the noise. And that's a nice thing. Other things that I would like to add in is things where if you fire your gun and there's birds singing, the birds stop singing and they fly away. It'd be brilliant, but on my list of shit to do, that's fairly low. So I try, like, at some point, yes, maybe if I get a chance to, that'd be a wonderful thing to have in. But that is not the point of the game. That's not what we're trying to aim. That's just a nicety that we're trying, that's something for later for sure.
Yeah, well, now I think it would be a good moment to watch another clip. So this is a short trim of some of the ambient sounds from 9 to 5 that were already introduced. Alright, so this was an example of some of the ambient sounds we have already in the game, and but as you might have noticed, there are also some different sounds that you've heard on this video, and those are the sounds of the player. So as you know, a character has to make some sound, be it footsteps, or the sound of the clothes, or the sound of the swinging weapon, and maybe this would be an interesting topic to discuss.
Absolutely. Player movement sounds, or like what the player hears all the time, is actually really, really important. It's also really, really hard, because there are two aspects of this. There is you as a player who plays the game. Imagine you play for just 2 hours every night. How annoying is it going to be if you hear the same thing all the time, and it's like, no. People, like, yes, it's a nice thing to have, and we need, like, we need to be reasonable, and we need to be realistic, and we need to not be annoying. But at the same time, we have to make sure that what the player does and how the player does it actually provides the player with the right kind of feedback and the right kind of feeling. So it's like, if you've got a big gun and you've got heavy armor, you kind of want to feel like you're a bit of a juggernaut. You don't want to feel like you're not. But equally, at the same time, if you like to play a little bit of a rogue kind of role in the game, and you decide, actually, I want like a really small 9mm pistol with a silencer attached to it, and I want the lightest armor so that I can be quiet and I can be peaceful and I can sneak, you should be able to do that. So what I've done when it comes down to the player movements and things like that, we've done what I call broad strokes, or a baseline, if you will. The baseline being, we have footsteps. Well, we actually have the game split into 3 different elements when it comes down to the player. We have the player character, which is you, the player. We have the friendly, which is your teammates. And we have the enemy, which is anyone else. And each of these sound unique and different. Specifically, you, the player, your main point of contact and your main sort of point of focus is what you are doing and how you are doing it. We've deliberately made a point of having the player footsteps be a specific volume. Everybody has the same kind of footstep sounds. Each material that you walk on sounds unique and different, whether it be concrete or mud or wood. It doesn't matter what the surface is, it will sound different and it will sound unique. Your movement is then split into 2 parts. We have your legs, which basically is your trouser movement as you walk and as you move. That has its a specific sound to it, because there are other elements that we might want to focus on as well, which is the armor aspect of things. The armor aspect of things is, depending on what armor you are wearing, should sound different depending on the kind of armor that you're wearing, whether it's like light, medium or heavy. Now here's where we do something a little bit more different to what most people would expect. From a very early point in the game, we have to make it very clear to the player who is your friend and who is not. And the easiest and the quickest way of doing this is to make the player sound a very specific and a very unique way. As such, we've designed the player character to have a very, like the normal footsteps that you would expect to hear, the normal trouser movement that you would expect to hear, and normal Foley movement. Actual, Foley movement, for those that don't know about it, is actual movement of cloth when you're sort of looking up and you're looking down, and like any movement that you make with the top part of your body, the torso, makes a unique and a specific sound every time you move. For the player character, it doesn't matter what armor you have, whether you are light, medium or heavy armor, it doesn't matter. It will sound reasonably the same. There are some nuances there. You rattle a little bit more if you have heavy armor, whereas if you have light armor, it doesn't rattle as much. But the volume and the assets that I've used for the player character are fairly uniform, and I've used the exact same sounds for the friendlies. They are handled in a different way. They have a completely different attenuation that is attached to them. However, from the very start of the match, when you start the game, you spawn at the side of your colleagues and you all start moving at the same time. The first thing that you see, the first thing that you hear is you see your colleagues and you hear yourself, and you realize he sounds just like I do. Maybe a little bit different, a little bit further away, there's a bit of distance attenuation there, but they sound fundamentally the same. When you hear an enemy, they have completely different armor sounds. If they're wearing heavy armor, they sound like they're wearing heavy armor. They sound big, they sound bulky. You can hear them from much further away than if they was wearing light armor, which doesn't sound big, it's not bulky, it doesn't rattle. It sounds much tighter, it sounds much more sort of cloth based rather than heavy sort of Kevlar jacket kind of bass. It sounds fundamentally different. It has a different attenuation based on there, because light armor should not be heard from further away. But we did that deliberately. That is as designed, purely and simply because we wanted to tell the player straight away, this is your friendly people. And if you hear something that doesn't sound like the people that stood next to you, they are not with you. And we wanted to be absolutely sure that the player understands that when it is that they are moving.
Yeah, okay. Well, obviously, the sound of the footsteps and hearing other players is very important in 9 to 5, as well as in the other multiplayer shooters when you play against other people. So how do we prevent like sound of the footsteps being covered by other sounds from the game? Like, is there a certain way that we can still make the sounds of the footsteps more distinct, even though there's like a shooting happening on the streets or some action?
Yes, we're actually there's so many different ways of dealing with this as a situational thing, not just from a telegraphing aspect of who hears what and what is actually physically being played, but also in what I would call as to be a conductor system, which is basically it's dynamic mixing, and how we consider what is the most important thing that we actually want to hear, and you'll hear me talking a lot later about threat levels and what is a threat level to the player, and the highest priority of which we can hear those. And the plan for us at the moment moving forwards is going to be making sure that what the player actually hears and what is important for the player at that time is what is in a direct threat to that player, and how that actually affects their gameplay and what they hear. That is also directly related to different elements of the game and different elements of the ambience, which may be, you know, the term I would use is occlusion, which is like what you can hear when someone stood behind a wall versus somebody is above you or below you, and things like that. So there's many aspects of the positional audio that we work on with that. There's many aspects of the occlusion that play into that. And there's many elements there with the actual mix, like, well, how loud is that? You know, and depending on how loud that is depends on how high that threat level is, and that's one of the areas that we're going to be investigating and just tightening up now that we're getting to a position in the game where we can start investigating and we can start looking at, okay, well, we've got these sounds, this player sounds like this player sounds like this. How do we make this sound much more vital to the player? You know, it's like if there are one person over there and one person over there, who's the highest threat? You know, is it going to be that guy over there? Is it going to be that guy there? Or is it the guy that stood right behind me who's sneaking up behind me with a pistol? You know, what's the highest threat level there? What's more important? And what tactical decisions do I have to make on a second-to-second basis? So a lot of the work that we're going to be working on in the coming weeks and coming months is exactly how we can actually improve that experience for the player. And it's not just a case of saying, oh, well, it's easy, we just make this louder, or we make this quieter, or we make this shorter or longer distance sort of thing. It's about how natural and how good it feels for you as the player. Nothing is worse for a player than feeling like it's unfair. If you're concentrating on that guy and then that guy shoots you and someone comes up behind you and one-shots you in the back of the head with a shotgun, it kind of feels unfair because you didn't know the guy was there.
Yeah.
So we need to try and mitigate that. But at the same time, the guy who's sneaking up behind you kind of wants to feel a bit rewarded for getting the jump on you. So we need to sort of investigate how we can make that as part of a player experience without affecting the second-to-second gameplay and without actually interfering with missions and objectives and making sure that it's actually well balanced and a fine experience for everyone.
Yeah. And another question from the chat. So you mentioned that the character, the player's character, has different components of his body that produce different sounds. So have you splitted them all into different audio channels, or and are you merging them with a different volume ratio? So how to make them sound?
We kind
right.
of. What we do is we have different player states, and each different player state has different elements that are attached to it. For an example, player footsteps, and you know the player footsteps and the trousers, for an example, the lower half of the torso, are linked as one sound, because generally you're not going to move your legs if you don't move your feet.
Makes
so
sense.
It's a reasonable assumption that the footsteps and the legs are going to be the same thing.
Yeah.
We then have that in an audio bus in Wise. An audio bus, for those that are sort of curious, is effectively, if you think of a mixing desk, you know, in a recording studio, channel 1 would be the footsteps and the legs. Channel 2 might be the upper torso. Channel 3 might be the gun. And what we do is we actually add in a separate audio bus for almost every element of the game has a unique or a section of that which is in a subsection of something else. A good example is the footsteps have their own unique thing, so we can adjust the volume of just the footsteps. The player foley or the armor is in a completely separate one again. So like when the player moves, we can like, oh, that's not quite loud enough, we can make that a little bit louder, but just for the player. But we have the same setting for friendly. So the friendly one, oh, the friendlies are a little bit too quiet, maybe we want them, so we can just bring that up. But we don't, we think their shoes and their, you know, we think their footsteps are fine, so we can leave that. And the same for the enemy, and the same for, you know, almost every element. But then those will have a parent aspect of that. So if we decide, actually, globally, you know, all of the player and the friend, like all the player movement is actually quite quiet. So we need that to be quite loud. So we can go into the parent of that, and we can say, actually, make all of these a little bit louder. But we can also make it a little bit quieter. If we decide the ambience is really, really quiet, can we turn up the ambience? Yes, we can. What part of it? Well, all of it. Okay, one click, there we go. So we have, as I've tried to keep it as modular as I can, and I've tried to make things as close as I can to a reasonably tidy hierarchy. So like in the, you know, we have like game sound effects. So if all the sound effects are too loud, we can globally turn all them down. Underneath that we have ambience. underneath, you know, and then under ambience we might have wind, we might have water, we might have, you know, any element of that. And then like underneath that we might have like explosions, and in the explosions we might have, you know, the actual the tail of the explosions. We might have the physical materials, you know, the impact sounds of things. That they're all of them are all separated, and we have absolutely control over all of those, not just on a final mix level, but we can then dynamically mix that. So we might decide actually what we want to do is if you have a sniper rifle and you're looking down and you want to concentrate, we might want to drop down the volume of the ambience, because that's a really low priority. Nobody really cares about that while they're looking down the sight of a rifle. But we might decide what we want to do is if you're looking down the scope of a rifle, what becomes important to the player then is anything that's around them. So we might say, okay, well, anything like, well, let's bring up the volume of the enemy footsteps, because while you're looking down the sight of a sniper rifle, you're not aware of what's going on around you. Your situational awareness has shifted, and because your situational awareness has shifted, you will want to think about other things as well. You will want to know that someone, even in a light armor, is sneaking up behind you, because that's not your primary area of focus. So we do have control over that.
Well, okay, and I think now we can have a look at another clip then, where we just we can hear a player's footsteps on different surfaces in the game. So just to give you an overview of how people actually sound in 95. All right, and this was some footwork from in old New York. And as you might have noticed, that also different place that the player is located in makes the sounds a bit different, and that is due to the reverb, and which
yes, we have a room system of which we work on. So. A little bit of a backstory here, I guess, to an extent. I don't want to waffle on too much because I'm sure you're fed up with my voice already. But one of the things that we try and do is we have to try and get all the element of audio to the same level at the same time. Unfortunately, we're not like Activision, we're not like EA, we're not Battlefield, we're not Call of Duty. We don't have a 25-strong team, 3 years and billions of dollars. We have literally me, desperately trying to make everything sound good. And in this respect, we have a lot of issues the same way as the art department might have, where they might spend a lot of time and effort making one particular building look absolutely gorgeous, but if everything else is really, really shoddy, then that one pretty building doesn't matter. So you have to make sure that everything is brought up to the same standard at the same time. Audio is no different. And because of that one basic principle, there are a lot of things and a lot of decisions that we've made when it comes down to the audio design, the implications of that, the implementation of it, and the overall effect that that has, which we've had to kind of bring everything up and then bring it up again. And one of those areas is, in fact, the occlusion system and the room system, which is basically how we tell the game, or how we differentiate between the player being in an indoors or outdoors. And the way that we've done this is with reverbs. Now, this sounds very sort of bizarre because it's kind of ambient based, but it's also related to the weapons, and it's related to how the player hears things and the perception of the world around them. Every single interior in the building has a reverb volume that has been sort of added to it. This is basically a box that we put inside it. So you imagine a square room like this room here. We would actually add in a physical box into that map, and we'd say like this here, this room is going, you know, this is now a room, this is an interior. That tells the game, if the player is inside this area, then we're going to set this switch in the audio system saying, oh, you are now indoors. And in Wise and in the audio side of things, we can switch between using different sounds depending on whether we are indoors or outdoors. And with the weapons, for an example, this boils down back to when we're dealing with the sound of the weapons, we immediately remove the tail of the gun because that's the sound of the environment of you all being outside. If we take that away, the sound of the gun doesn't have that echo of you being in a field anymore. That just has the bang, the onset, and the thump. What we then can do is we can then apply a reverb, which is an echo or the sound of a room, in that actual building. So if you are inside that room, you are inside that volume, that cube, we will apply the reverb to anything that is in that room. So every single room that you go into, whether it's a small tiny little wooden room or a giant big building, it will have a different kind of reverb. It will sound unique, it will sound different, and that's what makes the guns, which already have their characteristics of whether it's plastic or whether it's metal, it still sounds like that weapon, but when you're in that room, it sounds different when you are indoors or outdoors. And that gives the player something. It tells the player that I am indoors. It gives you that sort of feedback. It adds that nuance there. But it also tells other players, if I'm outside and they're inside and I hear, it doesn't sound the same. It's like, well, I know they're inside because I can't hear the echo around the buildings. And it tells you something. It introduces something new. But what it also does is it also adds bigger problems when it comes down to adding these in to the game world. Old New York it's an okay, for the game that we are playing, it's a reasonably sized map. But there are a lot of interiors, like quite a lot of interiors. And it's a boring, it's not a great job to go in, I want this going in here, I want this, it needs to be this bit, it needs to be this, right, slightly to the left, and okay, right, does that, I need to apply this. And it gets really old really, really quickly. But what it actually does is it gives us an opportunity to experiment a little bit when it comes down to interiors, because we can apply a priority system. So there might be instances, and in one of the examples that you're going to see in a minute is going to be a big building with smaller rooms that are inside of that one room. And inside those individual reverb volumes that we have, we can set a priority system. So if the player is inside one room, which is a big volume, then that's going to play a big volume. And it's going to play big reverb, it's going to be big noises. If they go into a smaller room, we don't want to hear this big volume anymore. We want to hear this tiny little room. But that also means that we can give that a room tone. So if you walk into that room, it should sound different to if you're working in another room, and that should sound different, that should be unique. That gives the player something, that gives them intrinsic value to where it is that they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, how they feel about it. But what it also does is it also gives me a big problem, because there's a lot of work, there's lots to do. So some of the examples that you hear, you'll be a bit, oh God, that sounds awful. We've deliberately engineered the reverb so that you can tell where the player is, what they're doing. So you might hear the player walking into one of the rooms here and you might be a bit, oh God, that sounds awful. It's not going to stay that way. It's there deliberately so you can hear difference between the player going into this environment to the next environment and the next environment. And it's all related to how the player can perceive the game, what the player can hear. So if you're hiding behind a cover and you're in a room and someone else is in that room as well, and they reload and they shout reloading, or they do something or they move, and you can hear the echo. You might not be close enough to hear them actually sort of reloading their weapon themselves, but if you can hear the echo of that, you can hear that in the room, that gives you something, that gives you value as a player. And we've designed these buildings and we've designed the interiors to work this way specifically because that gives the player something, it engulfs them in gameplay. And it's probably not the best way of doing it, we know that, but it's definitely the easiest and the quickest and the most efficient way of us making sure that anybody that plays that game is directly immersed in the situation that they are. And at this point, I want to say a big thank you to our QA department and Yana, who's been really, really good at just sort of going in there and doing that kind of thing and helping me out with that, and some of the other guys that have been helping out, just with a lot of this stuff, because I don't have time to do this kind of thing, so I'm just throwing that out there because I can. So
That's fair, that's fair. A lot of people have worked on this, and we are all very grateful that a lot of them are currently watching this stream. And
thank you.
yes, yeah, we hope to see some of you guys here some eventually on these developer streams. So QA, yeah, and without further ado, let's have a look at another clip which highlights some of the reverb and the environment sounds that Rob has just mentioned. All right, so that was an example of reverb and the echoes that you can hear in the water plant, one of the main buildings in Old New York, where a lot of action happens. But now I would like to ask another question from the audience, and it's more related to the environment. So how challenging and how difficult to make a three-dimensional space and to indicate to the player the sounds from every possible direction, so they would be able to recognize where the sound's coming from and how close is it, and what are some of the tools that you use for it, or some tricks you have in your sleeve?
Sure. In relation to effectively what we're talking about here is positional audio. Positional audio is how it is corresponding to the orientation of where the player is facing, whether something is to your right or whether it's to your left or whether it's behind you. We have an extra dimension in there because we have game elevation, so we need to know not just the X and the Y, but also the Z axis, like is somebody above you, are they below you, are they to the right or to the left. Wise handles this quite well with ambisonics. The game does and will support Dolby Atmos, as well as any other HRTF sort of things, as you know, all the way through to stereo. That is something that I know that we do currently support. And moving forwards, we intend on sort of supporting that in the future as well. That said, when you're dealing with just stereo headphones, which is what 90% of the people that are going to be playing the game are going to be playing with, we need to be smart with how it is that we deal with that. So we have to make the baseline decisions, and we have to assume that people that are playing this are playing with headphones. They're playing it probably late at night. They probably don't want to be disturbing their family, so they're not going to be playing on a 5.1 surround sound system, even though the game does actually support that. They're probably not going to do that. It's like that's realistically not really. It's not really the kind of people that are going to be playing the game. So when it comes down to the 3D sort of spatialization aspect of things, the way that we deal with implementing that information to the player is through curves, which sounds like such a random word to throw out there, but as part of the attenuation system within Wise, we can actually adjust the volume of how far away someone is when they hear something, and we can apply a curve to that, you know, how quickly that sort of steeps off, whether it's like, does it sort of like, is it loud and then gets really quiet really quickly, or does it get, is it loud and then only if you're very far, you know, only if you're very, very on the precipice of the distance does it actually drop off. So we apply that in regards to what is natural, and things like footsteps will have a different kind of curve to those of the guns. But another element that we can concentrate there on is called the 3D spread. And the 3D spread is basically how focused a sound will be. And the best example that I can give for this is, hopefully this will actually look good on the stream and not like I'm just trying to imitate a seal. But imagine that your arms are out like that, okay? If you're watching this at home and you want a bit of a giggle, put your hands out. If you try and lick your ear at the same time, it makes it easier. Also makes it a lot funny for anybody else who's in the room watching you. But imagine that this, as you're looking forwards, that is your scope. Like anything to the, anything on this side of this hand doesn't matter, and anything on this side of this hand doesn't matter. So this here, our area of focus, that is important. Now, that area of focus, imagine a sound coming from that direction. Now imagine that shifts over here. I'll do that away so you can sort of see what I'm doing. Imagine that that is your angle. Now imagine if that changes to here, depending on how far away someone is. So somebody who's very, very far away might be quite wide. Anybody that is like stood next to you there is very pinpoint, that he's there. So if you move over there, it's going to be like, it's pinpoint. I can tell, oh, he's on this side of me, he's on this side of me. The further away you go, the less likely I am to know that you are just here. If you get, as you get further away, that sound gets wider and wider and wider. For the guns, the way that we deal with this is we say, if they are very, very far away and they're very, very distant and all we can really hear is the tail, then it's quite wide, but it's still like, well, we know it's to the left of us or we know it's to the right of us, but it's too far away for us to really know about. As they get closer, that narrows down. So if we go, oh, we know that they are there, or like, actually no, they're over there. If we know that that's where they are, we know that they are not too far away, that it's broad and we don't know where they are, we know they're getting closer. As they get closer and they're stood right at the side of us, it isn't going to be pinpoint. Like if you're stood here and you're shooting at me and you move, it won't flow.
Yeah, shooting, yeah. Yeah, carry on.
But it should be a little bit wider because you're stood next to me, and if you've ever fired a gun and you like it's a wide sound. Like if you're right on top of that person, you should both hear it. It shouldn't be like if you can see them and they are in the vicinity.
So it is harder to pinpoint the exact location of the sound when it's right in your face.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, if you're stood right next to me and you've got a gun, you're waving it in my face, the chances are I know where you are. So finding the being able to identify the 3D position of that person is less important. So the actual curve itself, actually, it's not like just one linear sort of mark, which like, oh, no, it's wide and then it gets to this particular point. It starts here, it comes down to a particular point, and then it comes back out again as you get too close to me. And that's something that we have to do for every weapon. And it's exclusively just a weapon. For footsteps, we wouldn't want that to be the case. We would want somebody who's far away. It's like, well, if they we want them, or we want to know that guy's coming from over there, because you can, the footsteps. You will hear the gun much further away than you'll hear their footsteps. So by the time you hear their footsteps, they are in a point where they could deal you damage, and you need to know where they are. So we deal with each individual case by case very separately, but we have to make sure that they don't interfere with each other and everybody knows what they're doing.
What about sounds of the environment? Do they have certain curves as well?
Yes. Some things like if a pipe is leaking, for an example, that is an ambient sound. It is it's inconsequential to gameplay. That is a super low priority for anybody that is in that area. So we give it a low priority, of which to the point that only if you are directly in the vicinity of that do you actually hear it, and when you do hear it, it's super low in the volume. It doesn't matter. And with the priorities of the audio and everything else, if there is like all 9 of you descend on this one particular area and you're all trying to bloody kill each other and you've all got machine guns and all hell breaks loose,
like,
the
boom.
chances are that sound of that one pipe leaking probably won't be playing at that point. So it doesn't matter where it is in the 3D world. Nobody cares. So we deal with that on a case-by-case basis, and but at the same time, if you've got a sniping position and you're camping in one particular area and you're trying to, you're covering your friends that are going down there and they're trying to complete the objective, but you're here and there's a pipe there, that's going to be there. That's, you're going to hear that. But at the same time, if you're aiming down the sights, we're going to duck that down, and that's the spread of that, and the position of that is going to be low, and that's going to be wider, and we adjust that according to the gameplay situations on what is important to the player at that time.
Well, actually, you have a bit on unrelated note, but still related to the positional audio in a sense. So you have a history of working in your previous work in with games that are not first person, but like a third person perspective. Yeah, and how different is it to develop the sound from the first person perspective versus the third person, or when you're not necessarily inside that character, but you have to observe him from a distance?
The main difference is the concentration aspect of what is important. When you're in a first person perspective, you will hear the movement of the guns, you know, the clicking of the guns. You will hear some things are more important to you as a first person shooter than they are as a third person. If you're in a third person, the camera is further away. You don't care how that gun sounds when you're moving with it. You just don't. What you do care about, though, is everything else that is around you, you know. But you have an advantage where you can see everything else that is around the player. If you're in a first person, you can't see what's behind you. You don't know that there's an enemy there, so you have to focus on that. You have to make sure that the person that is playing the game can indeed actually focus on that. So from that perspective, the priority list and the what is important for the player changes. The actual design of the sound themselves doesn't really change that much at all. You know, like people still make a noise when they move, people still fire guns, it still goes bang. You know, so the actual designing of the sound doesn't matter. It's the priority in how you present that information to the player that is playing at the time. That's what has changed.
Well, okay. Actually, we have one more topic to discuss about 95, and then we will move on to the question. So this is the telegraphing. So I would suggest that let's start by watching a clip. So this is a same gameplay situation that you've seen at the very beginning of the stream, with a shootout on the street and then indoors, but filmed from the perspective of the second player.
Reloading. I'm reloading. I'm reloading. I'm reloading. Medic.
All right. So in this clip, we wanted to highlight the telegraphing. So it's the system how you are get the information that you are being shot, or if you are shooting at a certain target and you are hitting it.
Yep.
And how can you explain maybe in smarter words?
Sure.
How do you achieve this, and what's important?
We have the player telegraphing. This is the bit that people kind of they take for granted. You know, good sound design is often ignored. I've said that on numerous sort of previous occasions, but it's actually very true. And the way that information is telegraphed to people, if it's done in a way that makes sense and that's good, people don't really think about it. And actually, when you dissect that and you think, okay, well, how does that work? What actually do we need to telegraph there? And in our particular case, in a shooting instance, there's really fundamental basics there of like, am I being shot at? Who am I shooting at? Are they connecting? And is somebody else hitting someone else? So what? And then we have a priority system that goes with that. So the first thing that is most important to you, the player, is am I being hit? And the question is, obviously, you know, if you're being hit, then yes. You know, how often am I being hit? How much damage is that actually dealing to me as a player? You know, does it make much of a difference, or is it a heavy shot? Is it a small shot? Like, am I okay with my heavy armor if this guy's got a 9mm pistol, or do I need to get into cover? So we have to telegraph that information to the player. Now, this is outside of such stuff as, this is outside of things like the UI and the actual sort of gameplay elements of this. But this is more on sort of like how it's broadcast to you, the player. They're like, oh, I'm actually being hit here. I need to not be in this particular moment. So we make a point of saying if the player is hit, then it plays this sound. And that sound supersedes literally everything to the player at that particular point in time. It ducks the volume of absolutely everything in the game world, so the player knows I'm being hit, I need to not be in this position right now. I either need to find cover, or I need to eliminate the enemy, or whatever tactical decision the player needs to make. They have the opportunity and the means and the information to deal with that information. The other aspect of that is, if I'm hiding in cover and I open my eyes and I pop, 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 like that, am I actually hitting the person that I'm trying to that I'm shooting at? How do I know that I've hit that person? So what we do is we then play a different sound of that person being hit, and depending on their armor that they have, whether it's light, medium or heavy, which again is iteration back to how they sound when they move. When they move, if they're heavy and they sound clunky and they sound heavy, if I hit them, it plays the sound of me hitting the enemy, whether it be light armor, medium or heavy armor, but that plays just for me. So I know every time if I'm shooting my gun, pop, 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 if it hits a wall, I don't really hear that if it's far away. Pop, 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 pop. If I hit the player or I hit armor, it plays in my ear. I know, like, oh, I've hit someone and that's big, it's heavy, it's rattly. That guy's got heavy armor. What gun have I got? Have I got an SMG or have I got an LMG? Like, what can deal the most amount of damage to that armor? And this is why we need to know the difference between the type of guns that we have. We know that an SMG, which has a high rate of fire, can probably shred armor quite well. So you might decide, oh, he's got heavy armor, so I'm going to switch from my pistol to my SMG. I'm going to drill him down. Bum, 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 bum. I know that. Once his armor has been diminished, and we now know that we've gone from being armored to now we're doing actual damage to his health, the sound changes from the impact sound of armor to that of flesh being hit. You know, at some particular point there will be vocalizations there. So when the player gets hit and they've got armor, it's just going to be uncomfortable grunts and moans, like almost like you're being bruised. If it starts penetrating you with hits and you start dealing damage to flesh, those grunts and those noises that the enemy make go from being grunts of discomfort to outright agony screams, and you know, the more damage that is dealt to the player, that is reflected in how they sound. Why do we do this? What's the point? Well, the first reason is because you as a player, you need to know that the shots that you're firing they count, they matter. But it's also about player satisfaction. You know, we want you to be able to go, bah, 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 and now the guy's dead. Yes, you sit down, like, yeah, have that. You know, it makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you've accomplished something, and you know that player has been, they've dealt damage. We also do things when it comes down to the player being down and the player being killed. If you're shooting someone and you and you shoot them and they get knocked down and they have to be revived, or like they have to damage, you know, they have to heal themselves. We want you to know that you've done enough damage to that person that that's a thing that's happened. Equally, if you kill that person, we want you to know that you've killed that person. But there might be a situation where you and you've dealt a lot of damage, but someone else shoots them twice and they get the kill. But we want you to know as a player that you've assisted in that. So if you pop and they shoot and you hit their army, like, I've hit that person, and then that person dies, we play you a sound that's saying, like, that person died, but you assisted in their death. So you feel like you've been rewarded in the actions that you've just taken.
Mm-hmm. And does telegraphing includes only the sound of damage and shooting, or are there any other aspects of like voiceovers or objectives?
The telegraphing of information to the player is fundamentally, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects of any game. We have two aspects of this: information and instruction. We want the player to be informed on what it is that they're going to be, you know, on their current situation, and instructed on what it is that they want to do at that particular moment in time. As such, we have, from a voiceover perspective and from a dialogue aspect, we have two elements of the game. We have an oracle, which is effectively the person that tells you what it is that you are doing at that particular moment. You know, you go here, do this. Go and diffuse this. You know, go and get this code, hack this fault. Go here, do this. This team member did this. The enemy is doing that. That supersedes absolutely everything in the game, because that is fundamentally telling you what to do and how to do it. That is important for an objective-based game. Mm-hmm. The second element of that is the second-to-second element and the telegraphing of information. Am I being shot? Am I being killed? how much damage is being dealt. This again goes down to the voiceover things of whether you're being hit with your armor. You know, you go from grunts to screams to shouts to blah. Suddenly you're dead. But it also comes down to a ping system as well, and whether you're, we have player and then friendlies and then we have enemies, and they all sound different. And sometimes you don't want other people to hear things. If I'm playing with my team and I say, I want you to go over here, so like on my ping system I might say, right, I want you to go here, look at this, or like there's danger coming from over here. I only want you to know about that. But you need to know that it's a team member that's saying that rather than an enemy that's saying that.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between voices should be different. So the player voice will sound different to your friendly voice, and you should know what that difference is. The enemy. This becomes more appropriate with things like grenades. Really good example. If I hear a friendly voice shout grenade out, I know it was a teammate that did that. If I hear an enemy voice shout grenade out, not only do I know that he wasn't on my side, but I now know that there was an enemy in the vicinity.
Mm-hmm.
And let's be fair, if you are trying to play the game stealthily and then you throw a grenade, any element of stealth that you once had has the minute you throw that grenade is gone.
Yeah.
So at that particular point, all bets are off. Everybody knows what they're doing, and they can deal with that accordingly. And we have to demonstrate that. And we have to literally telegraph that to the player. So depending on what is happening at the time depends on what the player hears and how that information is actually fed to the player. As a general rule, if you are close to your teammates, you will hear them speaking and you will hear them as their actual voice. As they get further away, if they're doing what's called an action, like throwing a grenade, if I'm on the other side of the map, I don't want to hear over my communication thing that you've just thrown a grenade. I'm like the other side, I don't care. I only really want to know that if I'm close enough to that affect me.
Mm-hmm.
That said, if I'm on the other side of the map and you decide, I need help and support, SOS, can someone come and help me please, I should hear that. So the way we telegraph that is, we telegraph that via a comms system to the player. So that will be played for you, the player, as a friendly when they say, I need help, can you come and help me? Yeah, absolutely, I can go there, I can do the thing. And that's actually told me. And that's part of the game. However, most people will play this game and they will use voice chat. And you can talk to your team members as actual physical gamers, as players in real life. And that is by far the best way of playing the game. That said, not everyone has a microphone. Not everybody wants to do that. And we should be accommodating those people that don't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that we're going to penalise people. Like it's each to their own. But there are systems that we are putting in place that make sure that anybody can play this game regardless of their preference and how they want to play the game.
Well, so what are the ways to differentiate the voice of the enemy and the voice of your own teammates in terms of voiceovers? Are there simply different voices, or are there any effects that the enemies would have? Or
as a general rule, we base a lot of things on vicinity, and the plan moving forward. God, I sound so corporate when I say moving forward. The plan as we progress is to actually have very distinctive voices. So your friend, your player as a player has a voice. It has very specific characteristics, and that is what you as a player will hear. Your teammates will sound friendly. They will sound similar to you.
mm-hmm.
The enemy will be so significantly different that you cannot mistake it for being a friendly. At this stage, we don't know how that is likely to happen because it's an ongoing process like that. Mm-hmm. That's I guess, a psychological element. It's like we need to be very careful with how we present that information to the player. We've got to be mindful and respectful of accents and, sort of how voices are actually presented to you, the player. We don't want to alienate people that are from a particular region, and we certainly don't want to sort of cause any form or kind of problem that might be associated with the good guys or bad guys. And and this is from someone with an English accent. Like you're talking to someone who's literally got an English accent, who's either makes a really good guy or a really good bad guy, because that's just how the English accent works. We're not going to do that. We're not basing things on accents or localization. Like that's not how this works. How it will work, however, will be based on distance. It will be based on very specifics and very nuanced, like, that's clearly not a guy on my team, and we need to make sure that people understand and they know the difference.
Well, as a person with a perfect Russian accent, I strongly appreciate this notion. Yeah, actually, we will answer just a few questions which we have collected from the chat and from prior to the stream, but we only have 15 minutes left on this stream.
Sure.
So let's just dive into the questions right away. So, Rob, when you started in working on the sound of 9 to 5, what was the first and most important thing that, sound-wise, that was done for the game?
The first thing or the most important thing?
Like, let's say when you start developing a shooter like 9 to 5, what do you focus on first? Like your first day at the job?
The first thing that I did when I first started at the company, one of the first things that I did to contribute to the game was I built the ambience, because there was no game world ambience at all. And even if it was just a very simple, I'm going to add in some wind, I'm going to add in some ambient hum, I'm going to add in just something so that the game world isn't silent. And that immediately changed how people perceived the game. And when you're dealing with an ongoing development process of a game, perception, especially to the designers and artists as well, how they perceive the game when they play the game, if it doesn't sound very interesting, it's really hard to get invested in it, and it's really hard to try and give anything that resembles quality feedback. The second thing that I did, or the most important thing that I did to contribute, was immediately went in and removed all of the footstep sounds and replaced them with dynamic system that changes depending on where you are, because the placeholder assets that we had was literally just one physical material, which was concrete, which was just left and right foot. I then replaced that with, each footstep there's like at least 35 to 60 individual footstep sounds for each individual physical material in the game, and each one of those has a slightly different volume, so it gives it depth, it gives it real character where it is you're moving, the speed that you're moving, whether you are crouched, whether you are running or walking. Running is louder and is quicker than walking. Crouched sounds more deliberate, and that added a lot, and that changed things. And then anybody that played either in Friends and Family or the Alpha will be massively impressed with just how far we've come, not just on the audio front, but the game as a general, when the next close test happens. But you can probably see already how things are starting to improve just by changing how things sound. Like, how do we improve how the gun feel? How do the designers cope with the gun feel, and how do they make a gun feel more powerful without actually changing the statistics? Or if they change the statistics of a gun, like, this gun's really, really powerful now, but it sounds like a pea shooter. Like, we have to change that with the sound. So making each gun sound different and unique, and then adjusting that to compensate with the loudness and the volume and the width and all of the things that we've discussed already tonight are automatically just adjusted and changed with the balancing. Like, this now doesn't sound like this, it sounds like this, because it doesn't cause this much damage, it causes this much damage. Once we'd actually started adding in new movement sounds, we'd added in an ambience and we'd added in the guns, the game changed for everybody completely. It's only when we go back and we play really old builds, like last Christmas we played a super old build and everyone was just like, oh my god, this sounds awful. Thank you, Milosh.
Okay, when you're creating ambient sound or like this general sound of the game, what is the vibe and the atmosphere you're trying to go for? Like, is there a certain word you can describe?
Accepting, I think, is the word that I want. I just want to be loved.
Oh, no.
Basically, I guess because I'm the only audio guy working on this, everything that you see and hear, not necessarily see per se, that's art, I suppose. Everything that you hear has been made for a very specific and a very tactical reason on my behalf. I'm like, I'm trying to create the audio direction of the game based on not just what I think needs to happen, but I also have to base it on what the game is calling for. And as a first-person shooter, we have to look at a lot of the documentation, and we have to look at the mission flows and the objectives and what happens. I spend a lot of time talking to Borek about sort of what the game does and how it does it, and then I might talk to Martin, who works in environment, and I say, well, what about the environments that we're in? Like, how does that sound? And then we might have to look at the difference between set dressing between different rooms and how those rooms sound, and do they sound empty or are they cluttered? And some of that has changed since we did alpha, and like some of the rooms were empty and now they're not empty, and like the level design has changed. So I might have to talk to Tony, who's one of our level designers, and say, actually, like, how do we want this to sort of feel when we're in this area? And it all has a knock-on effect with not just the direction that we need to take with the audio, but what's important for the player. Talking to you about how the gun should feel, and what kind of, like, how he wants the player to feel when they fire that gun, and how they want that player to feel when they've been shot by that gun. That's all has to be taken into consideration on the bigger picture. So I'm kind of trying to basically juggle with knives at this particular point, but I can't juggle, and I'm forever cutting myself on literally anything. So yeah, that's audio in a nutshell. This has been my TED Talk.
It will be only appropriate to ask, what is the most challenging part of your job? As a, well, maybe
living.
I didn't finish. As a sound designer for 9 to 5.
The most challenging aspect of my job at the moment is to, in all honesty, and this is coming from the heart, this is genuinely being able to give the project the quality and the love that it deserves is probably the most challenging thing that I can do. There are only so many hours in the day that I have. There's only so much that one person can do. As it happens, we're expanding our department. We've got some new guys that are going to be helping out. We're outsourcing some aspects of the game to really solid, incredible professionals, and they're really helpful. But the most difficult part is, if I don't do it, it won't get done, which is a huge burden for anyone of any department, and all of us here at Red Hill are in exactly the same situation. If we don't do it, it won't get done. And there are expectations of us, and we are a massively eclectic and an incredibly talented and very experienced crew of people. But it's really easy to forget we're not AAA. We're not a 600-man team. We've not had 5 years. We're a small team in Finland. And it's really, really easy to forget that with the kind of with the kind of visibility that we've had and the kind of game that we're making. It's really easy to forget that. And if we don't do it, it won't get done. But we're human. We've got a life. We've got families. We've got stuff that we want to do outside of this. And Red Hill are fantastic at giving us the opportunity not to be constantly here working all the time. And that, I think, is the most important thing of my job, and also the hardest thing, is trying to find that balance, but also not get too wound up and too caught up in the aspect of, actually, it's okay for this to happen. We're good with the community. We talk to people. They are really, really good with us, and we really super appreciate everybody who actually involves with us in Discord. And people that are active in Discord, you'll notice we have a suggestions area, and we have a common suggestions, and then we have like things that people like, actually this is a really good idea. We will actually take those ideas and we'll run with them. Some of them might be really bad for whatever reasons, but some of them actually like, do you know what? Sure, let's do that. That helps us quite a lot, and it's really, really important for people, especially people that are new to the game and new to us as a company. They understand and they appreciate the fact that we're not a big company, and we are trying to give you what you want to do, what you want. Which means it's cool, it's brilliant, we get a lot of feedback, but it also sets some pretty high standards and some pretty terrifying sort of like some terrifying limits there. We're like, ah. Yeah,
we're very grateful for everybody who are sitting and talking with us on Discord and who are giving us the
Anybody
feedback.
that's listened to me waffle for this amount of time.
Most certainly. And yeah, so yeah, please keep on being awesome and give us all the suggestion and the feedback. We're always listening to what you got to say, and we're happy to implement, and we have implemented some things that people have suggested to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that this is time for us to wrap this up. I hope everybody enjoyed our first dev stream, and we're gonna have more of this in the same format with different guests, and we're gonna talk about different aspects of development 9 to 5. So, and we actually would like to hear your feedback. What do you think about this format? What do you think about this particular stream? And give us your comments and topics you would like to hear about and things we can improve.
And I actively encourage everybody to get involved. You know, go onto the Discord, go to the website, sign up for the Discord, go in there. Most of us developers are on there. You'll see me there as Audio Rob. You know, by all means, you reach out to us. You know, like anybody that's in the community who's watching this. If you're in the chat, give us a ping, say hello. Let's share some of this. Like, we want to talk to you guys. We want to get it all done. You know, we want to do what you want from us, and it's really important to us that you guys know that this whole thing, this whole situation is a new thing for us. You know, we're at the new studio. We've got the, you know. It's terrifying. Like Simeon's been terrified all night. You know, his stomach's been doing some weird noises that, like.
I'd rather not go into that topic, to be honest. And yeah, there are actually a couple of things I would like to say before we finish. So first one, guys, please go to our Steam page, wishlist us if you don't want to miss any updates from us, and if you want to participate in upcoming close tests. And also, Rob, a few people have asked if you can just play something with this guitar.
Oh my God.
Like your favorite riff, let's say so. If they were able to hear anything though.
God, really?
Yeah, it's like a Chekhov's rifle. You put it here, it gotta be shot at some point.
I've got 3 minutes. Okay.
Yes. Like, should we do some microphone or?
No,
I think they're gonna be able to hear you.
Sure you can.
Smoke on the water, maybe.
Smoke on the water.
I mean, or Wonderwall.
Yeah, Wonderwall. Yeah. Wonder why, more like.
Or yeah, just some leak. Just give us something.
Really? Thank you. And good night.
Beautiful. Okay, good night, everybody.